final day at 5 p.m. to apply for your mail-in ballot. We are going full steam toward Election Day. Thousands and thousands, I would say nearly 3 million Pennsylvanians have applied for vote by mail. So it's pretty exciting that we are going. And this topic tonight, very timely. I want to thank the leagues of Chester, Delaware, Radnor, Lower Merion, Narberth, for which I'm Voter Services Chair, for putting this together, and Anna Marie Hessman in the background doing all the technical work. Because it does matter. Chris and I were just talking about this virtual world we're in, how he's teaching classes from home. And then it does allow us to bring you these great programs, even if we are in the midst of a pandemic. So happy voting to everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to Chris for being here. And we're going to talk about the Electoral College. Pennsylvania in particular, we know that all roads to the White House lead through Pennsylvania. Right, Chris? I mean, it's pretty obvious. We are ground zero for both of the candidates, the current incumbent, the president, and then also Vice President Joe Biden. For those who are coming in, I've started, we're recording, so we'll just hide your video because we're in Zoom, and we're also going live to YouTube. So I'm going to start off right away with kind of the broad picture and ask you, Chris, what is the Electoral College, right? Because I think many people think they vote, and that is what's deciding who the president is. So maybe you could tell us, what is the Electoral College broadly, and when did it come about?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for having me. The Electoral College is basically a compromise. Like many at the time of the Constitutional Convention, it was meant to kind of mediate between there being, too much direct involvement of the people, while also avoiding, too much implications of conspiring or plotting. It was a little bit unique. It kind of got added as the committee of what's her name again? The Committee of Detail. That's right. Was doing their work in Philadelphia. And there was debate about how the president would be selected. Some people might know that, Alexander Hamilton would have been fine with almost having a king. Lots of other people didn't want too strong of a president. So, it was meant to be a compromise, and not let Congress do this directly, give kind of the people a crack at it first, but to mediate, through, random representatives. It wouldn't be a standing committee was the logic.
Okay, so this dates back here in Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, right? So is it part of the Constitution?
Yes, yeah. It's. I mean, there have been some changes to it, but the concept of electors, it changed very quickly. The 1800 election, not just the Aaron Burr Alexander Hamilton duel, but the fact that Burr and Jefferson got the same number of votes, they had to fix that. So the 12th Amendment changed that. But it is provided for. And like a lot of things in the Constitution, which is a relatively short document, there's only so much specificity you can bring, which allows for a lot of the controversy.
Well, that's interesting. You talked about some of the history and then revisiting it in the 1800s. But what the founding fathers were looking at and their concerns, do you think that's still relevant now? I mean, they probably never could have imagined, like even California, right, with 40 million people. Mm-hmm. So do you think that their goals are still relevant now?
I mean,
is that a long-winded question?
No, not at all. I mean, there's a yes and there's a no, right? I mean, I think most people's objections to the Electoral College today is that it's not representative enough, right? You can win the popular vote, lose the Electoral College. And that wasn't as big of a concern for the framers. So in one respect, people's biggest objection isn't something that the framers shared. But the way the Electoral College works it's a very far cry from what the framers had in mind. I mean, they didn't anticipate political parties the way we have them today. I would say the biggest issue is the fact that most states have, a winner-take-all system. So like all of California's votes are going to go to one candidate or the other, whereas, most of the evidence we have is that the framers, and that can be a broad and ambiguous term, but Madison and then Jefferson wasn't a framer per se, but he's a founder. They wanted it to be the case that the votes could be allocated district by district. Like we might get to this later, like what Nebraska and Maine do, right? So
right, we'll talk about that.
So that would be more representative. I mean, they cared about the representativeness of it, but they didn't want it to be pure direct democracy. And today, most people want either the pure direct democracy, or they just don't know that this isn't nearly as representative as the framers would have wanted.
So you mentioned votes, and maybe we could talk about how they're allocated and how they were set up. I'm going to show a map for everybody, but I'm going to let you talk away.
Sure.
So I'm going to show the map, and is this coming up? I just want to make sure. Do you see the
I
map
can see
there?
it. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. You don't see my background, right? You just see the map?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I'm showing here the way it currently is right now with the electoral. So maybe how many total votes are there, and how do we get to that amount?
Yeah, there's 538 votes, and that is 100 members of the Senate plus 435 members of the House of Representatives plus 3 for Washington, D.C. So each state gets, 3 is the minimum because you'd only have 1 representative, like the Dakotas and Montana and Delaware, and 2 for your Senate and 1 for your members of the House. Washington, D.C., it's not tricky, it's just unique. That was the 23rd Amendment. And their population would justify more than 3, but they're limited. They can't have any more than the state with the fewest. So they'll,
And where did that 3 come from?
Well, so DC, I mean, for DC or overall?
Overall, yeah.
Yeah, 2 senators plus 1 representative in the House of Representatives. Every state.
So DC being the outlier.
Yeah, it just can't have more than 3 at this point. Right. So.
And really important to know, we have Guam, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands. They are not accounted for in the Electoral College, correct?
That's right. They cast ceremonial might be. I don't mean that to sound condescending, right? They're allowed to vote, but they have no electoral votes. They can make indicative, like Hillary Clinton won, I think it was Guam, 3-1. It didn't amount to anything in terms of the Electoral College. And obviously there's a long history there. And
yeah. And so the 20, you talked about population, and population would account for that. Is that why, like, say, for instance, Pennsylvania has 20 and California has 55? Right.
I mean, basically, if you just look at the numbers, that's a proxy for the population of the state.
And is this redone after the all-important census?
Yes. It depends on how deep we want to dive in here. But yeah, I mean, that's another reason why this election is so important, because it control of state houses, determine in most states who gets to do the redistricting. And Pennsylvania is probably going to lose a seat. They'll probably be 19, in 2024. So you're going to have a fight over, drawing those maps, and 2 incumbents will probably have to run against each other.
And it definitely should be interesting. We at the League are big advocates for redistricting reform, certainly bringing the case to, as plaintiff, about the congressional districts, but also to reform with Fair Districts PA. So it's interesting that all of this is linked. And we also see, we're going to be talking about some litigation, and how that could impact what happens, because people are concerned. So we're not here to make people more anxious, right? We're just here to inform them. But certainly it's important that people know, for instance, if they're in Puerto Rico, it is ceremonial when they go to vote for the president. And whether you think that's fair or not, we'll be talking about maybe some ways that people are working to change this, right? And is that a good thing or not? So I'm just going to take the map off, but I want people to remember the 20 for Pennsylvania, because we'll get back to that. So we talked about allotting and the votes, but you also mentioned electors. Who are electors, and are they even elected? I mean, the name sounds like they're elected, but they're not, right?
Yeah, they're electors, in that they do the electing. They're not elected themselves, and this will. Again, the original notion was that it should be diffuse. There really was a concern that the president not be chosen in a way that would be susceptible to foreign influence, right? And so there was worries about members of Congress conspiring. Diplomatic relations with France were a big deal under the Adams presidency, for example. So they wanted people drawn kind of from the population at large. So the states were just permitted to figure out how the electors would be selected. Once political parties came on the scene, that changed that calculus a little bit. And today, every party on the ballot basically has their own slate. So whoever wins the state, their slate of electors has the right to cast the electoral votes. In some states, you just have, in Pennsylvania, it'd be 20 electors. And in a lot of states, it's apportioned out district to district, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And so these are often, party loyalists or it's a bit of a reward. I mean, it used to be viewed as a largely ceremonial role. We can talk about faithless electors and whatnot in a minute if you want, but there's pretty good sense that they're going to do what the party wants them to do, unless their vote won't ultimately matter, and then you get some of the faithless elector stuff.
So I can't just decide that I want to be an elector.
No.
So is there a way to find out who the electors are? We were asked this, and I think it's pretty interesting.
I'm not certain, but I suspect you would want to contact the party, right? Go up through the state party. It might be, I don't actually know the answer to that. I'm not going to pretend that I do, but it's going to be folks that have served their party, loyally.
And when you say party, it is primarily the two dominant parties of Republican and Democrat.
Sure. But I mean, if the Green Party's on the ticket or the Libertarian Party's on the ticket, they will, and again, this might be ceremonial, but they'll go through the process of selecting their electors as well. I mean, it's often a reward at the state conventions.
At state convention, which was interesting because we did everything virtually, or one party did mostly virtually. So we looked at the map, we talked about electors, how they're chosen, that they're not really elected, as that's just a term for them. And then I should also get back to our electoral college. Like, it's not a place where you're actually going to college, right? I mean, you would be surprised. Yeah. People don't know these things.
Yeah, just more in the sense of, collegiality or a coming together. And I don't want to overdo the history, but the sense was that they would meet in their state capitals so that they wouldn't all be in any one spot, right, in 1796 or what have you, because that would make it harder for there to be any, plot that would steal an election. So if the states selected them and they all went to their state capital and cast their ballots around the same time, then it wouldn't be a single thing. France or Great Britain couldn't just send a few agents provocateur to blow the whole thing up. I mean, that was very important to the framers that there be, they didn't fully trust democracy, but they definitely didn't want elites pulling strings from behind the scenes in a way that would undercut any faith in the system.
Well, democracy itself is a very fragile thing. We see even attacks on that now. But I want to get back to the electors and their voting and the slate of electors. Certainly, you would think if they're party loyalists that they're going to go along with the party nominee. But there have been instances, right, where the electors do not go along with the slate of candidates.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. What usually happens is that they will indicate their distaste or their agitation by voting often for the person that they think probably should have gotten the nomination in the first place, right?
Right. Like we saw in 2016, there were several Democratic electors who voted for Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
I mean, and that also happened. I mean, I think somebody voted for like Colin Powell or something.
Yeah, Colin Powell.
He's not even running for office.
Right. And I think Trump lost a vote in 2016. Go back to 2004, John Kerry lost one to John Edwards, right? I mean, it usually is a way of registering dissatisfaction or blame for losing. It's never been the case that it's been in position to throw the election. Mm-hmm. And I think it's reasonable to think that most of these faithless electors would have, voted for the party, for the person on the top of the ticket if that ever had been the situation. They're not going to throw away the election. It's a way of registering.
Right. And different states have different rules as far as, I mean, some even have penalties, right? So a state can legislate and make rules around their particular electoral college process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they definitely can make rules. There actually was just a Supreme Court decision this year on this topic. An an advocate for ending the Electoral College managed to get the case before the court. And it was somewhat just raising awareness, but the court said, and this was unanimous, that states could indeed, compel the votes to reflect who they had pledged to support. Before that, yeah, we could talk about penalties, but are the penalties just threatened, or do they have teeth to them? And the court said that, yeah, I mean, states can, require the votes be cast for who they've pledged to, which, if this isn't a common law class, but that raises a lot of issues about how you make heads or tails out of relevant language in the Constitution. But the court didn't seem to want to engage that. I think they wanted the certainty more than they wanted to, have perfect consistency.
So the court has been rare to even pick up any case regarding Electoral College. We'll be talking about Bush v. Gore, but we'll get to that in a bit. But so this all important 270, like if you watch cable news and they have the maps up and they're drawing, and what if there's a tie? I mean, it happened before.
When?
Oh wait, no, sorry.
It's never. Yeah,
before it was redone in the.
Yeah.
Okay. In history, before it was redone in the 18 something.
It's definitely happened that there hasn't been a majority, which would be, yes, you're right, that would be the same thing as a tie, essentially, because it would go to the House of Representatives. So, yeah, if you want to go back to 1824, that would be our precedent here. It wasn't a tie, but nobody had majority. And this is what the framers did have in mind. They wanted the candidates to have a chance to get a majority, but if they didn't, if nobody got a majority, they did not want a candidate to become president just with 40% of the vote or 40% of the electoral votes. They really didn't want a plurality president. And so they had a sense that they might see a lot of elections end up in the House. That's only happened in 1824 so far. But what happens at that point is that the House of Representatives votes, but they vote, just each state gets one vote, right? So there's the anti-democratic or the non-democratic component to it. So California gets a vote, Rhode Island gets a vote. It's more like what the Articles of Confederation were, and the states probably wouldn't have gone along with that otherwise. And the other thing to note is if it comes to that, it's the new Congress that votes. It won't be this Congress. It would be the Congress that starts in January of 21. And right now, I should have verified this. If you fold in third parties, I think right now the Republicans either have a 26-24 advantage, I believe, statewide.
Yeah, I looked it up today.
Yeah.
So you're correct.
But I mean,
but we don't know what it will look like.
Right. There's a few states that are very, very close. So it would be hard to predict how that would turn out.
That's interesting you bring that up. I mean, this is all very interesting because I think there's been, and look, this comes from the president himself that, on the one hand, he says, if I don't win, I'm going to move to another country. But on the other hand, it seems like he just won't leave. And so, I mean, we're laughing, but, this is something that I think we need to talk out. So you mentioned about January 20th. Well, technically the day after, right? So January 21st. I mean, there is a system in the Constitution, right, for making sure that we have a new seated president, right? So you just can't hang out there. So I just you're the person, I just want you to say it, that we do have it in our Constitution, that there is a system in place.
Yes, there definitely is. The elector, I mean, there's the quote unquote safe harbor provision, at which point the elections are certified, the electors have to, begin the process of going to cast their votes. If safe harbor creates any, movement in people's memories, right? That was a big discussion in Bush Gore 2000 was
right.
The Supreme Court said, well, we're getting close enough that we have to make some decision with finality.
So let's talk about that, because that's a good example, because we do have a lot of timeline discussion. And there is a timeline, right, for when the states are to tell Congress, right, like this is our electoral votes and so forth. So there is a timeline for that. And then there's the timeline for the president to be seated on January, new president, January 20th. But this timeline has come up in the news because of mail-in ballots. And I sent you an article
Yes.
because for those of you who are watching, this became national news. The Atlantic published an article really about what we're talking about right now, which was, what if Trump doesn't leave office? I think, unfortunately, we have to also consider that sometimes this stokes the fears of people. So I want you to know, when Chris and I are discussing it right now, it's to do the exact opposite, because we do have a system in place. We do have checks and balances. So in this article, Pennsylvania came up because the PA GOP leader seemed to indicate, and I'm being kind when I say that, he was quoted as really indicating that the goal of the strategy of the GOP was to push off this timeline, because we know we have 3 million ballots. The GOP legislature would not change that time frame to allow early canvassing, which is the opening sorting and so forth of millions of mail-in ballots, which could mean that, of course, we are not going to have results on election day. And this timeline for when we find out who is the quote unquote winner, it could be pushed off. Right now, let's be clear, it's not going to be pushed off that far. But what the PA GOP leaders seem to indicate is, yeah, it could. And then the state legislature, which is the GOP-led legislature, would in fact choose the electors for Pennsylvania. So I want to ask you about that, Chris. Like, is that a possibility, and is that legal?
Well,
Putting you on the spot.
yeah, I mean, it's a possibility. It's a remote possibility, I would say, but the fact that it's been floated by somebody at least indicates that it's been discussed, right? I mean, that wasn't just a, idle. Is it legal? Well, what's a court going to say, right? I mean, all we know is what gets decided ultimately. I mean, if we were doing this, 20 years ago, but had a crystal ball that told you how Bush v. Gore was going to turn out, most constitutional law scholars would have looked like fools, a week before the election, right? So much of that was, ad hoc, and this might head in that direction if it goes that way. The irony of sorts, though, is that, all of those concerns were about if ballots were still being counted, after the fact, when, yeah, I mean, some ballots won't get counted. That's always going to happen. The court's already indicated, like in Wisconsin, for example, fewer will be counted than many folks think should. But there's also been such a surge of early ballots coming in, right? I mean, I think we're almost to 70 million votes nationally, which would be, that's over half the number of votes cast. So yeah, some ballots aren't going to get counted, more than probably should be the case. But anything beyond that will kind of depend on what the numbers are. I mean, what did Pennsylvania have in 2016? I think about 6 million. So
yeah, I mean, we're setting records now for number of registered voters, well over 9 million now, and over 3 million vote by mail. It's the first time, thanks to these new election reforms, that couldn't have come at a better time. So you're saying this whole strategy, I'll put that in quotes, really, maybe it is better that it was put out in the public and that we can discuss it so people understand there is a process and a procedure, and that this is not likely to happen.
Yeah, again, I mean, there will always be some votes that come in right at the deadline and don't get cast, right? But I think with the mail slowdowns in the summer, I mean, I think one clear consequence of that is so many votes have come in early. I mean, people do adapt their behaviors. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish. I don't want to sound, but the odds of it coming down to that still are pretty small. I mean, even some of the people I read who are most strongly opposed to that sort of, gamesmanship, for lack of a better term, are saying this is how it could play out if it all goes sideways, if it all goes haywire. But the odds of that happening, still don't seem very high. So
right.
Rational.
You have to consider,
yes,
when you link it to gerrymandering, and that many of these state legislatures are GOP led due to gerrymandering of the red map, a decade ago, it isn't so far fetched, right? And then, of course, the founding fathers had really no idea about special interest and money, lack of campaign finance. I mean, they never even knew what was coming down the line. But let's get back to Bush v. Gore. I mean, look, in law school, election law, when I was in law school, that was the seminal case, right? And yet you're reading it. So, of course, Bush v. Gore, Bush did not win the popular vote, went to the Supreme Court. I mean, any basic law student can tell you, wait, why was the Supreme Court deciding this case, right? It was really unprecedented. And then yet, just last night, I got home from working on the election offices. And I know I had talked to you earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I stayed up last night and I read that opinion from the Supreme Court out of Wisconsin, in which the Supreme Court, and I would say the two opinions by Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, were very startling. And it was the first time that Bush v. Gore was cited as some kind of precedent, and precedent meaning binding legal authority. So let's get back to Bush v. Gore, and maybe you could tell us, like, what happened, how does it hold, and do you think that could happen now? And it does kind of peripherally have to do with, and not peripherally, directly deal with the Electoral College.
Yeah, it absolutely does, because I mean the fate of Florida's votes were decided, by Bush v. Gore, and as a result, the fate of the whole election was decided. It was such a convoluted and ad hoc decision that the court explicitly said it shouldn't be relied on for precedent, right? Which is, yes, I think, why it was so startling to see it cited.
Oh, it was scary. As a elections, somebody who works in elections and an attorney, I was scared when I saw it.
And we can maybe talk this out if depending on how much time we have. But I mean, Gorsuch is an idiosyncratic justice. Kavanaugh's opinion just had errors in it, right? I mean, Kavanaugh's just, I'm not saying Gorsuch is right or wrong, but
I want to say, for the people who are watching, it's very important to know that Justice Kavanaugh was part of the legal team for Bush in the Bush v. Gore case before the Supreme Court. It's very important to know that.
And in 2000, he and Roberts too were arguing that votes should be counted past the deadline. I mean, ultimately it's politics, right? I mean, in 2000, the Bush campaign thought that the late coming votes and veterans were brought up too, right? Like absentee ballots from overseas. So they wanted,
because military, that's federal law. So military overseas ballots, they have up to a week to come back to be counted.
Right. So yeah, we're just not in a place where there are A, settled principles, and B, even if there were, they're just not going to be honored consistently, right? It's ultimately politics. But the kind of quilted together argument in Bush v. Gore was that, to keep recounting ballots with different standards in each county would violate, some notion of the equal protection of voters, right? Mm-hmm. Which again, I sound like I'm trying to talk past it really quick, because that's just the best way I can describe it.
But it didn't have to turn out that way, right? Because you've told us about going to Congress. So was that an option, and could Gore have done that?
It would be tough.
Great video on this, by the way, a great documentary.
Yeah. I mean, there would have been, it was going to get settled one way or the other. Somebody was going to clear 270. The real issue, right? And if this is, if we're all wrong about this, then this will be kind of the irony is the debate was, can the Supreme Court step in and say that the Florida Supreme Court doesn't get to say what, the Florida Constitution means? Because it's almost always the case that, state constitutions are up to the state Supreme Court to kind of give the final word on. I mean, states can, the example I always give, like with respect to rights, states can raise the floor. I mean, the Constitution just provides a floor, but states can protect individuals' rights to a greater extent than that. And the Supreme Court can't do anything about that if the state constitution says that. So usually state Supreme Courts are the last word on state constitutions, just like the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was, for the gerrymandering case.
Right. I was going to say a great example is the case brought about the congressional maps, but if you read the opinions, and now we are getting
Yes.
into some legalese, because I think it's important for people watching. I mean, this literally just happened yesterday.
Yes.
And Pennsylvania, again, is going to come up as really what could be incredible precedent and really undo even my entire law school learning to really the case. So it was appealed again. So for everybody watching, this is this extended deadline. The PA Supreme Court, so our state highest court, has said, that ballots, as long as they're postmarked by election day, and everybody watching who has a mail-in ballot, you should take it right now to a Dropbox. You should not wait. But the PA Supreme Court said, as long as it's postmarked by election day, received 8 p.m., it can be counted and received up to 3 days afterwards. So they extended this receipt, right? So it's not about the postmark or so forth, but it's about, okay, it's postmarked, but we'll receive it up to 3 days later. Now, looking at the decision that came out yesterday, where it was a bit concerning because under Kavanaugh particularly, he was indicating that the Supreme Court and not the states are the final arbiter on state decisions around elections, so for the people watching, this was, so all of our great leaders who know about civics, which many people don't, but this case had already been appealed, right, by the PA GOP up to the Supreme Court last week. They 4-4. So the court, I mean, this is like a drama unfolding in real time. 4-4, no opinion came out. So this is really interesting. They denied that they would hear it on that extension, right? So they didn't hear it. And then now they have reappealed. I mean, there's res judicata and all kinds of issues here, but let's just get to the fact that now they've reappealed up to the highest court. We see this decision that came out of Wisconsin, on the Wisconsin extension, which they shot down, right? And Wisconsin, we know 79,000, 80,000 votes that this could impact, right? Which is the margin was way smaller than that Trump won in 2016. So is there a concern that, that they will pick it up now that we have a new Supreme Court justice? I mean, I've been hearing that she could start as early as tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, she's been confirmed and sworn in. Yes, there's definitely that concern, right? No doubt about it. What really, I mean, just one more added variable, I guess, right? I mean, there's another principle, and it's not legal, it's not in the Constitution, where it's just a principle, but the Supreme Court's already relied on it in the last few months, is that you don't change the rules for the election close to the election. I mean, there has to be some reliance, and so. If the Supreme Court were to hear the Pennsylvania case again, and then say 5-4, shut down the counting, they would be overturning what they just did. And now it wouldn't technically be overturning because a 4-4 doesn't have any, but they've already settled it by not doing anything. That lets the lower court stand. So the principle would seem, hey, we got to let this go now. We're within a week of the election. So if they were to shut down counting, ballots postmarked by election day, but that aren't received until after, they would seem to be, suggesting they're being consistent with what they said about Wisconsin, but they'd be changing the rules for Pennsylvania after they already took one run at it and didn't. So that would be very, very stunning, frankly.
Do you think the distinction could be made that the Wisconsin case was a federal case that was appealed up to the federal highest, the Supreme Court of the United States, whereas our PA case is a PA state Supreme case? Well,
yeah, I think what's important is that among other things, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court cited the Pennsylvania Constitution in reaching the decision, which really ought to be the end of it. And so the 4-4 decision really just did say we're deferring to the lower court. We're not changing anything. When if the Supreme Court ties, it just lets the decision right below it stand. So to now, if it were to be the case that they decide not to allow those ballots to be cast, they'd be changing, what's called the Purcell principle. They'd be going back on, they'd be saying that they're more of an authority on what the Pennsylvania Constitution means than the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they would justify it in the language of the Constitution because they would say, state legislatures are the final authority. But yeah, it would be very, very messy. It really would.
So yeah, I mean, so I just want to continue on because we mentioned the confirmation, and I feel like you and I could probably have like a legal nerd constitution conversation all night. So you mentioned Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed, and so now we have on the Supreme Court more justices that were appointed by a president who was not the winner of the popular vote. Now, I know we're going to talk about my personal opinion that I don't think that actually reflects the will of the people. So I want to talk about maybe some movement, and this happened post 2016, really, I would think, when again, we had a winner, and this is not about whatever side of the fence you're on, but that we had another president who was not the winner by the popular vote by, I think, over 3 million votes. So, what did some of the states do, or what can they do? And I know this hasn't happened in Pennsylvania, but what can they do? And maybe let's then get into some movements of, is there a way to change the Electoral College?
Sure. Possibly, probably. But I mean, as you pointed out already, so much of this stuff feeds back on itself, right? I mean, some of these changes, if you're not going to amend the Constitution, which is exceedingly hard to do, would probably have to survive a challenge to the Supreme Court. And we just talked about how the Supreme Court's constituted now and how that's affected by counter-majoritarian, right? I mean, yeah, there's a couple different ways of looking at it, right? Trump wasn't popularly elected. The population of the states of senators that voted to confirm Barrett is substantially lower than the population of the states of senators that voted not. I mean, it's the same general argument. Is this moving too far in, looking out for the less populated states? So the workaround, the most common one now is called National Popular Vote. There's a website, well, more than one, but dedicated to it. And the genius of it, if it works out, is that it's a compact, right? So states just voluntarily say they would agree to this, but so it does
known as I'm just going to interrupt you. It's also known as like the Popular Vote Compact,
right? National Popular Vote Compact. Yeah. And states that pass this agree that not until this happens, but once it does, they will. Once enough states that add up to 270 agree to this, then their state agrees that their electoral votes will go to whoever wins the most votes nationally, right? Whoever wins the popular vote. So in one sense, you don't have to amend the Constitution because each state is just changing their law, right? And states can do this, right? Nebraska and Maine, like I said, divide these up by districts. So if California wants to say, if the legislature says, hey, our votes are all going to go to whichever candidate's, tallest, I mean, that would get struck down. But I mean, it doesn't have to be the way it is. So right now, I think it's 195, 196,
They're close. I keep looking, and I follow, they'll give you updates.
Yeah.
If any of you sign up for the website, they give you updates, and especially now people are looking at it.
Yeah.
Yes, you're looking, they send you emails periodically. So, Pennsylvania, though, as you're looking for that, Pennsylvania is not like that, right? So
right.
We're a state where, winner takes all.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, yeah. So I may have conflated two things. So the National Popular Vote Compact, and I found it, I'm just going to put that in the chat box for everybody if you want to take a look. That's to agree to apportion your votes.
So for instance, let me give people an example. Yeah. So say Trump Hillary, right, with California, she overwhelmingly won California. She would get the majority of their electoral votes proportional to her win in that state. Would that be an example?
No, I mean, okay. I might have misheard you too, but I was. Okay.
You're looking on there. I'm trying to give an example of the opposite of the, giving all the votes to one candidate.
Well, here's the perfect example then. I mean, the district by district, that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Right. Because if we're playing with scenarios that have, a couple % chance of happening, I mean, what if Trump wins Pennsylvania but loses Arizona? That would create a 269 to 269 tie. Unless
I already asked what happens if it's
but if Biden wins that one district in Nebraska, Omaha basically, then it would be 270 to 268, right? Because Nebraska can divide up their electoral votes.
Right. So for those who are watching, Nebraska has passed where it's not like Pennsylvania, right? Yeah. Where it's proportional.
Yeah, and I think that's closer to what the framers would have wanted. They wanted, each district to kind of have its own identity represented, and that they wanted a candidate to have to win 50% in a state, but they also wanted the states not to. I mean, the only reason to do winner take all is to make the state more important, right? Mm-hmm. To especially battleground states. So if we could wave a wand and just make it so that every state was district by district, then the candidates wouldn't spend 90% of their time in 7 states. But the states where that's the case, like that, everybody wants to maximize their own power. So the only 2 states that do it district by district are Maine with 2 districts and Pennsylvania, or I'm sorry, Nebraska with 3. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't make sense for California to do it because if it's 38-17, that's the.
So this is a way for states to get around amending the Constitution, but that is an option, right? And that would be a constitutional convention. What are your thoughts on that? And are there any kind of, I think we all know as leaguers, there's some downsides to that as well, like maybe opening Pandora's box.
Yeah, a constitutional convention would, I mean, right. I think you can't improve upon that metaphor. There's one law scholar who I read a fair amount, who's just, yeah, let's do it. Let's just open it up and see what happens, right? Kind of a devil may care attitude. But even then this group blog where he posts, most everybody else says, well, we well know that that's what he's about, but we're not itching to do that. I mean, anything could come out of that, right? And I don't think anybody, there just isn't enough motivation or incentive to do that at this point. And it's never really been done. I mean, the Constitution is usually ratified through the other mechanisms.
Well, right, like 19th Amendment, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary. Is that an option, and has there been any movement to do something like that?
It came somewhat close to happening in the late 60s when George Wallace won a few southern states that raised some concerns about some, Nixon won a much larger electoral college majority than the popular vote. Very, very close election. I mean, Humphrey almost got more popular votes, and Nixon still won a significant electoral college majority. So there was a thought that maybe we should move to a popular vote then. And it passed the House, but then it got bogged down in the Senate, filibustered. So that's part of what explains this national popular vote movement now, I think, is just, it's so hard to amend the Constitution that, a compact might work better. If we can just get enough states that are up to 272 to agree, then maybe we can bypass it, the thought goes. Now that would get challenged, and I don't know what this court would do with it.
Yeah, I mean, now we have to consider, and I always tell people to think beyond just the candidate that they're voting for. Certainly the case, that the president has, and I think Trump, certainly his legacy will be about packing the courts and the federal appointments from the lowest federal courts to remaking our highest court. So I think everybody watching here, they already know how important it is to vote and the impact of that. But it's certainly something when I tell people that now there are more justices on the Supreme Court who are not the nominee of the quote unquote popular president, certainly gets people thinking about their vote. Does my vote matter? And there's a lot of talk about the Voting Rights Act being gutted. Could we have a federal amendment for a federal, because many people don't realize it's not in the Constitution. So you'll hear my fundamental right to vote. And I tell people, you're laughing, right? No, it's not a fundamental right. But here in Pennsylvania, we're fortunate that it is part of our state constitution. So we've talked about some of these options. What do you see happening? I mean, let's talk about Bush v. Gore and maybe the impact, the decision that happened. You've probably been thinking and been asked, and you probably been asked by your family, like, what's going to happen? And have you played out some of these scenarios, and likely scenarios that could happen come election day, or really not election day, but in the week after?
But the trouble is every time you play them out, they go a little bit differently, right? And
Mhm.
you had mentioned, I mean, this has been a very Pennsylvania centric conversation, which everybody in America, is doing the same. I mean, I've gotten texts from several friends from grad school who are teaching at schools in safe states, and they're just like, what's it like being in Pennsylvania right now? I mean, because it very well might be, the tipping point state. That said, I'm not a pollster. My research area is more con law, but so I well, like a lot of you probably, I check 538 all the time. I check these other online, and the likely scenario still seems to be that it might not be decided election night in terms of the tabulation, but there's a sizable, gap in the polls right now. Um, the president has to defend a lot more states than Biden does. I mean, there's all this talk about, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, but Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida are all closer now, and Trump would have to win all three of those. So,
And even Texas with a massive amount.
yes,
I mean, I have siblings in Texas, and I mean, just the early voting numbers. And you do see, unfortunately, I think, there is this kind of party dialogue that Republicans are not in favor of vote by mail, this kind of early voting. And I do think it's kind of, they're trying to create some differences. Like maybe there's the election day voting and then there's the vote by mail voting. But I think we all know they're still the same. So people are voting. But this kind of fraction, I think, look, we could play out all of these scenarios. We did get a question here because I know I feel like you and I could have like a talk on the legalities for a while. So we got a question, but is a compact realistic? Can picture agreements and then jockeying behind the scenes for power deals? I think she's saying, with the quid pro quo, is it really a realistic thing?
yeah, I think it is. I think if you just mentioned Texas, I mean, the first election Texas goes for a Democrat, suddenly the compact looks a lot more attractive to the Republican Party, right? Right now, it's mostly states that are either purple or blue that have ratified the compact. California, Illinois, New York all have. But if Texas goes Democrat, then all of a sudden the two biggest states in the country are both blue. So, gee, maybe the Republicans say a national popular vote is now more advantageous to us. And to get to 270 from where they're at now, I think you just need Texas, Florida, and one other state. So maybe not tomorrow, but it's realistic. And then it would probably get challenged by somebody, and the courts would have to weigh in.
Right. Well, isn't there another way around it too? Like that legislatures, like even here in Pennsylvania, could likely flip. I mean, there's a lot of talk about that. And so they could react, right? Even if they don't win the highest office, and there still is the scenario where the president is the president without winning the popular vote, the state legislatures could flip and they decide, hey, I'm reacting to this. And it could still possibly happen in that kind of situation, right? Where if there's enough flipping, I'm not saying Democrats are totally
Right.
for it, but technically with more liberals are in favor of this kind of compact
Yes.
popular vote.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, things could happen, at the state level that make more states inclined to head this direction. And what would make it even likelier to survive a court challenge? There's compacts, and there are compacts that Congress can certify, right? If Congress ever said, hey, we think this actually is fine, we're going to certify this compact, that adds a layer of consensus to it that would make a court less likely to strike it down. But like you just pointed out, I mean, so much of this turns on political reactions to current events. The 12th Amendment could have been much better than it was, but the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson and Madison, who, Madison wrote the Constitution, they headed more in the direction of partisan politics in writing that amendment. They could have had the amendment say this is going to be district by district, but they didn't, because they thought winner take all kind of supported them in the moment. So at the end of the day, I mean, politics probably drives this stuff when you get time to make the decision.
I think everybody is interested to see how I too am getting text messages. People see 538, they see polls, like they see things. I mean, I'm probably one of a few people that do not watch cable news, and I just think it takes me down a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. But people read or see snippets of things, and even the polling. So we should talk about that. I mean, we're getting close to time. I'm looking at the time, but you can talk about polling. But I worked the Hillary campaign 2016. I was in North Carolina. And, I didn't think the polling show, we probably weren't going to win. So now I'm giving away my politics. So this is nonpartisan discussion. But I just want to say, polling, how much can we really trust polling? I mean, anybody who's listening to this, and like myself, it's a little PTSD that I know what happened. I mean, look, she did win the popular vote, but is there something that maybe you tell people to be, what is it you tell them? Like, polls are one thing, because you told us, there's sizable lead, but what's the realistic thing? Like, maybe what's the caveat you tell people, or do you not?
Well, I mean, the polls can be off, but I do think, well, people always want to fight the last war, right? I mean, 2016 was unusual in some ways, and there was a polling error, but it wasn't as big as most people remember or think it was, right? I mean, the state level polls, which usually are more accurate than just a national poll, showed a closer race than the national poll did. And as you point out, I mean, she won the popular vote. The popular vote totals weren't that far off from what polls indicated. Just the distribution were such that, I think everybody uses the metaphor, the President Trump drew an inside straight. I mean, almost everything broke right for him, right? I mean, to win Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. And to add to that, right, there are all these other factors that, it's hard to put a number on, but, gender played a role almost certainly, right? I mean, Joe Biden just doesn't have to take, some of the criticism that Hillary Clinton did. The Comey letter. I think that had a major effect, and there just hasn't been something like that. I mean, the press seems to be handling things differently. There's just so many factors that, in a perfect world shouldn't have an effect at all, but have had an effect and don't seem to be having the same effect this time around. And part of that probably is just people are more motivated on both sides, but I mean, the turnout totals are going to be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also a data nerd, and I track numbers, and I have to say, just the amount of people who have voted that didn't vote in 2016, and we're only in early voting, have really been astounding. So, I mean, it shouldn't be that people are reacting to things, but I am glad that people are voting. So we had a follow-up to the other question, and I know we're getting close to time, but the follow-up is, what would prompt the Congress to certify the compact? And do you think that that's realistic?
I mean, it would be Congress would just take it up if it reached the point that you'd have, 270, if the compact were looking like it would take effect. And I don't know if there's a special procedure involved, but it's Congress just agreeing to honor it. And it would probably depend on how intense the issue was. It would certainly, I think, depend on what the composition of Congress is. If you tell me what the distribution in Congress is, I'd be more comfortable making a prediction.
Yeah. I mean, and this is important for people who are watching, that our census is delayed. So the Congress that will be, if they did, looking at this, not just about a compact, but post this year into early next year, will be a new Congress, but it won't be the Congress post redistricting.
Right.
So it is going to be interesting to see. I mean, for all intents and purposes, I think we know now the Congress is Democratic. It's looking to hold that way too, and that's, we don't know who will be president. Certainly the polls have told us one thing, but in my experience, it's never a given. That was a very, it was a startling experience, because I was working, I'll just give you a little bit of my background, that here I am, I'm working voter protection, and we're in the boiler room, and you have all these maps, and, we lose the presidency because we see the counts for the electoral votes. But we didn't really have any time because we had, in North Carolina, we had a recount for the governorship. And we saw a lot of partisanship, a very heavily gerrymandered state like Pennsylvania. So we see all these things are playing out, but I think Pennsylvania, as I said right from the beginning, all roads to the White House are going to lead through Pennsylvania. Trump was just here yesterday, calling out our governor, who is a Democrat. I mean, he is whatever you could say about him, he definitely is an entertainer. And he looks to be, you're laughing, but look, the things that he's saying, people follow it, and they see it as entertainment. So it will be interesting how this plays out. Again, I encourage everybody to pay attention to that opinion that could or could not come from the Supreme Court regarding our extended deadline for absentee ballots. It's not just going to impact Pennsylvania, but will have a very big impact, I believe, on this election and on legal precedent. Hopefully not the way that I think it's going to go, because it's, as Chris and I discussed, it was jarring to read that opinion. And certainly this was so great. Chris, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I think people got a better idea of Electoral College, whether they agree with it or not. And I do hope people get involved. This is something just like redistricting reform. The league encourages people to get civically engaged, to really defend, as we say, empowering voters, defending democracy. That's what the league is all about. So join your local league, which automatically gives you membership to the state league and the national league. So putting that pitch in there. And certainly during this pandemic, I just want to say, I hope everybody is well and safe. And if you are going on election day, please wear a mask. There's no requirement to wear a mask, but please wear a mask, socially distance, and make sure you all have a plan to vote. If you've got that mail-in ballot, you need to go to a drop box or your elections office ASAP. Because we don't know what will happen, right? So right now, 8 p.m. election day, you got to have that ballot in. And we're really looking forward to seeing the outcome of all of this. So Chris, you and I might be back talking, in a couple.
I hope not. This has been fun, but I want it to be done. But yeah, I mean, who knows?
I know people say to me, when's this going to be over? And I'm like, it's not going to be over election night. But for people who are into this kind of thing, I mean, I'm excited to see it play out. I do believe in our system. I do believe in the fundamental democratic principles. And I think we wouldn't be having this conversation if that wasn't the case. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who joined. And we are recording this, so we will be sharing it out to everybody. And thank you again to Anna Marie in the background for doing all the tech, and to the Chester, Delaware counties, to Radnor League and Lower Merion Narberth, my home league. Thank you so much. And thank you, Chris. I wish I was in your class, but I'm not. Not anymore anyway.
Maybe as a guest speaker.
Oh, I would love to come.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I think I'll wait for